So I got a lot of good feedback on my Exorcist live reaction video, and I figured, hey, with the new one coming out next month, let's just do another franchise series of reviews. I also was looking forward to and was really wanting to watch The Exorcist 3, so I figured, yeah, let's just watch this whole franchise and give some reviews. And so I had to watch The Exorcist 2, The Heretic. Deep regrets. Welcome back to The Haunted Beard, everybody. It is all horror and thriller movie content on my channel. And listen, do not click that subscribe button unless you want to be haunted by the beard. So The Exorcist 2 continues the story of Regan, the girl once possessed by a demon who finds that it still lurks within her, and meanwhile, a priest investigates the death of the girl's exorcist, Father Merrin. So listen, I went into this thing with pretty low expectations, as I have not really heard anything positive on The Exorcist 2, and so going into this thing was not really expecting much, and still this thing managed to let me down. The list of redeeming qualities in The Exorcist 2 is very small, but I'm at least going to get into them real quickly. There are a couple things that I think are at least decent. It does have some nice cinematography and some nice lighting. Just some of the shots are pretty decent. Some of the music is decent. Ennio Morricone did the score, so, you know, I'll give him a little bit of a shout out. And I do think the opening scene where Father Lamont is in some sort of shack with this woman who is possessed is a pretty decent scene. It has some nice lighting, and it is a little creepy. Has kind of a bit of an eerie quality to it, and the woman then like catches on fire, and it's a little disturbing. That pretty much concludes all the positive elements in The Exorcist 2. So the movie sets things up with Richard Burton, who plays Father Lamont, and he is charged with investigating the death of Father Merrin and figuring out what exactly happened. And we pick up with Regan, and she is now seeing a psychologist and is just going through, a lot of therapy due to all the trauma she experienced in the first film. And eventually, Father Lamont and Regan's paths cross, and that really sets up the main sort of narrative trajectory of the film. My main complaint with The Exorcist 2 is just that it's just boring and really dull, and hardly anything exciting happens throughout really the entire movie. And oftentimes when I'm watching a movie and, you can kind of at least sort of appreciate the concept or the idea behind some movies that aren't good, but you can at least say, okay, I kind of see the attempt of what they were going for, but they just didn't really land it. I don't even think the concept and idea behind Exorcist 2 is good. I don't even see any sort of reason for why this was a story worth telling, because it's just not a good story or a compelling or interesting story at all. They pretty much devoid this entire thing of any sort of demonic activity or any sort of possession scenes, which is largely to the film's detriment, because the approach that they go for with the sort of partnered hypnosis stuff between Regan and her therapist, and then ultimately Regan and Father Lamont, is just a slog. So as I mentioned, eventually Regan and Father Lamont's paths cross, and they set up this sort of partnered hypnosis scene with these lights and these like headbands, and they're all like, hooked up to each other. And Regan kind of takes Father Lamont back to some of the events of the first film. And we get this scene that is Regan recalling a memory, and she is bringing Father Lamont into that memory. And the way that this scene is directed and presented is just not very effective. And we get this sort of like cross-dissolve effect where you can see both things happening at the same time. It's just really kind of dull. There's no tension. It's not really scary. And you can tell that the voice of Regan when she was the demon is a totally different voice, and it sounds awful. The makeup effects are different, and they're not nearly as good. And this whole scene is just not executed very well at all. And unfortunately, that's sort of the big approach here with this sort of demonic activity, is through this sort of partnered hypnosis thing. And just this approach is just yikes. And so through this memory, Father Lamont is now convinced that the demon Pazuzu, we find that out the demon's name in this film, it's Pazuzu. He's convinced that the demon is still residing inside Regan, and he kind of confronts Regan's psychologist or therapist about it, played by Louise Fletcher. They're kind of at odds because he's religious and believes in the supernatural, and she doesn't, and she believes in science and all that stuff. And I just gotta say, Louise Fletcher's performance in this is unfortunately, man, her character is, she speaks in like the most monotonous, dull tone. There's no like emotional inflection in any of her performance. It is, man, it's just so lifeless and dull. Every time she was on screen, it was like trying to keep my eyes awake. Then at about 30 minutes, enter the locusts. And I'll be honest with you, I am still not really entirely sure what the locusts are supposed to be or what they really have to do with anything. And I don't really even care to find out. I don't care enough to even go digging and to examine this thing any further. Now, if I had to guess, my guess would be that the locust is, I think, the vessel for the demon Pazuzu. He's talking to Father Marion, and he says something along the lines of, like, let's fly or something. So I think the locust is the vessel that the demon is using. And so through that, we are basically told that the demon Pazuzu is now officially back. At this point, Father Lamont takes Sharon, who is the housekeeper from the first film. They go back to the house from the original movie to investigate Regan's bedroom. And I have no idea what the scene is even doing in the movie. They spend like all this time, they get together, they go back to the house, and then Father Lamont goes into the room, says a quick prayer. We see a locust flying in the corner of the room, and that's it. And like, I don't really know what that has to do with anything. It just seems like a totally pointless and inconsequential scene. And there are a handful of other scenes like that in this movie as well. So we get another hypnosis scene between Father Lamont and Regan, and the hypnosis scene matches the dream that Regan is having. And she sees that Father Marin delivers Pazuzu from this young boy. His name is Kokumo. And there's this really poorly edited little sequence where you see the demon being exorcised out of the boy Kokumo. And it does these 3 jump cuts where his face is very clearly possessed, and then it jump cuts to where his face is a little less possessed, and then it jump cuts again to where his face is back to normal. It just looks really poorly done and cheesy. And it was at this point that the full just ridiculousness and absurdity of this movie fully kind of dawned on me. Because what just happened in the previous scene was this. The demon Pazuzu, by means of a flying locust through a partnered hypnosis, shows Father Lamont, the young boy Kokumo who he once possessed, who now has special powers over the powers of evil. That is one of the most insane summaries to a movie I think I've ever heard. And at this point in the movie, we're about halfway through, and this thing has been devoid of pretty much any and all tension. There's just nothing compelling going on here. And Pazuzu hasn't even been like a threat at all. He's been somewhat involved in the story, but he's been this vessel via a flying locust who is revealing Father Marin's memories to Father Lamont and Regan through this shared hypnosis procedure. Pazuzu's like the least threatening demon ever at this point. There's no threat. There's no tension. There's no suspense. There's no scares. There's no demonic activity. Not long after this, we get a scene where Regan is participating in her high school musical theater production of 42nd Street, and we get a tap dancing sequence. Why? I don't know. We're about 80 minutes in at this point. Still no tension. Still no demonic activity. Still the least threatening demon of all time. At this point, Father Lamont goes to Africa, and he hunts down and finds Kokumo. And lo and behold, we get good old James Earl Jones. And this is a scene in the movie that I have absolutely no clue how to understand or interpret or what exactly is going on here. He confronts Kakumo in this, what looks like a cave, and Kakumo tells him to make this walk of faith where he has to walk across this little section of like needles and spikes that are sticking up through the ground. And so Lamont takes one step and punctures his foot on the spikes, and then it does this jump cut where he is now in this, I guess it's some sort of zoo-like facility, and Kakumo is now a doctor or some sort of professional who handles, what would you know, locusts. And Kakumo is taking him around through this locust facility, and there's all these locusts everywhere, and they're just talking about the locusts and more locusts and more locusts. There's a lot of locusts in this movie. I'm still not entirely sure why. So then Father Lamont goes back to America and meets up with Reagan again, and he tells her he found Kakumo, and she says, "What did he say?" He said, "Kakumo says that there is good and evil inside of you, and we must fight it." Yeah, we already knew that. He goes halfway across the world, meets Darth Vader, finds out there's good and evil inside of Reagan, and she needs to fight it. Riveting. Yeah, tell me something I don't know. Basically, what we figure out, though, is that there are these special people with supernatural type abilities and powers to fend off evil. And it turns out Kakumo is one of them, and also Reagan is another one of them. And this demon Pazuzu has gone around specifically targeting these people, and Father Marin figured that out, and so he was going around finding these people to exorcise the demon out of them. Then we get the climactic sequence where Father Lamont takes Reagan and they go back to the house from the first film, and we get more bad makeup effects from the demon and a horrible voice that sounds totally unlike the demon from the first film. And then by the time the therapist and Sharon get to the house, Sharon just decides, there's this huge car crash that happens, and they like crash into the house, and then Sharon gets out of the car and lights herself on fire. Not really sure why. I guess maybe we're kind of led to believe that she was influenced by the demon, I guess. Not really clear. Pretty strange and weird, if you ask me. So then up in the bedroom, the demon Pazuzu manifests itself into an identical Reagan. So there's now two Reagans. There's Demon Reagan, Good Reagan, and Father Lamont. And this swarm of locusts come bursting through the window like a plague. And there's this big sort of battle between the three of them. And Father Lamont ends up killing Pazuzu by pulling out its heart, which is just really weird. Because in my understanding, demons are spiritual. They're not physical. And I know that the demon possesses someone, but in this case, it's possessing Reagan, but it's a totally separate Reagan. So I don't really understand how a spiritual demon can have a literal physical heart that can actually be pulled out of its chest. Your guess is as good as mine. And then in what has to be one of the most anticlimactic moments I have seen in quite some time, Reagan puts an end to the locust swarm by spinning her hand around her head, which is some maneuver technique she saw in one of her visions. And that is the end of the movie. Again, I come back to, I don't know why this story needed to be told. I don't really know what we learned from this. It's just all around a pretty dull and lifeless and boring and terrible experience. So yeah, those are my thoughts on The Exorcist 2, The Heretic. And here's what's really shocking, because I was reading some of the IMDb trivia on the movie and actually found out that Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino are both fans of this movie. Don't really know what they see in it. I'm a big fan of both of them. They're some of my favorite directors, but, you know, to each their own, I guess. But yeah, I did not find really anything in this very worthwhile at all. I think probably going to be like a 2 out of 10 for Exorcist 2. It's just not great. So anyways, those are my thoughts. Hit me up down in the comments below. Would love to hear your thoughts on it, especially if you're a fan of this movie. There's got to be at least be a few of them out there. I mean, Scorsese and Tarantino are, for crying out loud. But yeah, if you like it, let me know why. If you don't like it, like myself, let me know why. Would love to hear from you. Thank you once again for watching. Up next, Exorcist 3. I hear good things. I'm very excited. Sounds like, based on the little poll I did, I'm going to be watching the director's cut. And yeah, very much looking forward to that one. So that's all. See you next time on The Haunted Beard.